And okay, hi everybody. I know I am not Kathy, not the face that you are used to, but I am Tara and I work at ASM. She's unable to join us this afternoon, but we have Mr. and Mr. Siegel here that are going to present a very wonderful presentation that I think is so important for all of our families right now. So I'm just going to let you go ahead and introduce yourselves, and we'll have some questions at the end.
All right, thank you, Tara, and thank you everyone for having us today and joining us in the middle of the day here. So today we're going to talk about mental health, the pandemic, and effects and challenges for our youth with autism. So I'm Matthew Siegel. I'm a child psychiatrist, and I work for Maine Behavioral Health Care, running our services for people with autism and other developmental disorders.
Hi, I'm Emily Siegel, and I'm in private practice. I'm a clinical psychologist. Very happy to be here.
Okay, so 1 second. Okay, today we're going to, generally we're going to talk about autism and mental health. I'm going to start off talking about that and then talk about some of the effects of the pandemic, which many of you know very well. And then we'll shift to Emily Siegel, and she'll talk about our current state and the coming months and thinking about the pandemic and your children. So first, I want to talk about children with autism and generally sort of pre-pandemic or outside of a pandemic, just how do we think about mental health for our kids? And so there was a nice study that I like to refer to where parents were surveyed in the community, and this wasn't a clinic sample or a hospital sample. This was kids who were just identified as having autism on their IEP. About 500 parents were surveyed, and they were asked to rank, what are your common challenges? So the most the most common challenges, with the biggest challenges, were kind of what you might cluster as an ADHD cluster. So easy frustration, inattention, hyperactivity. And then followed by less frequently, but still present, temper tantrums, irritability, fearful or anxious, and then more rare, but certainly present, harming self, destroying property, physical aggression. So this is kind of a snapshot in time, asking parents, what are the problems that you encounter with your children with autism? So those are sort of problems. And then if we shift to, well, how do we think about this from a mental health perspective, and what's called psychiatric comorbidity, meaning that's just a word that means the co-occurrence of two things. So autism plus a mental health challenge like anxiety or depression or ADHD. And so this has been fairly well researched, and we know that for youth with intellectual disability, not autism, there's a pretty high rate of being able to diagnose at least one other mental health condition. About 40% within a year are diagnosable with a mental health condition. And then for youth with autism, it's actually much higher. So within 3 months, it's about 70% can be diagnosed with at least one mental health condition. And the pie chart on the bottom right actually shows that of that 71%, about half, roughly 30%, it's actually 2 or more mental health conditions or psychiatric disorders, as it says. So the point being that outside of a pandemic, just in our regular life, as many of you know, youth with autism have a high risk for having other mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, OCD, etc. So there's been some various studies. Well, how common are those more specific disorders or diagnoses. And so this was a nice study looking at that. And it was a study that was children who were, I would say, at least moderately verbal to fluently verbal. So this didn't capture our kids who are minimally or nonverbal. But in this study, what they found was not surprising, which is that anxiety disorders by far are the most prevalent form of mental health challenge for kids with autism. And that's what you see on the left, that whole group on the left, those are all anxiety disorders. Specific phobias, OCD, separation anxiety, social phobia, generalized anxiety. So anxiety was the big one. And then next most common or most prevalent was ADHD. And then less common, but 13% was depression or depressive disorders. And then less commonly than that was ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. And then more rare is bipolar disorder or a psychotic disorder. And so interestingly, this is actually the same pattern that you see in non-ASD kids. So in the general population of kids in the United States, the most common mental health condition is anxiety disorders. People think it's ADHD, but it's actually anxiety disorders, followed by ADHD, followed by mood, such as depression, and then followed by more rare things or less common things like bipolar disorder or a psychotic disorder. So the order is the same in autism, but it occurs significantly more frequently, about 3 to 4 times more frequently. So I wanted to spend some time on anxiety because that, as I think probably likely everyone on this webinar knows, is probably the biggest feature, one of the biggest features that our kids wrestle with often. And so I want to spend a little time on that. And of course, something that the pandemic, you can easily see relates to. So anxiety and autism is something that we've had an evolving understanding of over the past, I would say, decade, particularly, and trying to understand it better because it is both like anxiety in kids who don't have autism, and it is not. And so it's complicated, and so I think we're starting to get a better handle on this, but there's still work to be done. So first of all, clearly some kids with autism present with very traditional anxiety symptoms, kind of classic generalized anxiety, generalized worries, or classic separation anxiety, or classic OCD, right? And they're more likely to present with those traditional anxiety symptoms that might be more easily recognizable. If it's been shown that kids who have a higher IQ, greater verbal ability, or are older and are more socially connected, those are the kids who are more likely to present with kind of traditional anxiety symptoms. But then there's this whole bucket of atypical anxiety symptoms that we see in kids with autism, in some kids with autism. And those include, are not limited to, but include fears of and negative reactions to change. So just change itself can induce great anxiety. Social unpredictability, fear of, it doesn't say this here, but fear of social situations where they're not fearing social appraisal, meaning they're not fearing what people think of them, they're just fearing the social situation itself. Whereas in classic or typical social anxiety, it's a fear of what people think of you, of negative appraisal. Then there's the concept of intolerance of uncertainty, and I have a slide on that in a second, so we'll wait for that. Having unusual phobias. So phobias just means a very intense specific fear. So, a phobia of the sound the vacuum cleaner makes, or something like that, that is, less common in kids who don't have autism. Fears that relate to their special interests, which is an interesting area, right? So some of our kids with autism, they have their very intense special interest, and sometimes it can be almost a love-hate. They can love it, but also become fearful of it or of losing it. And then compulsive behaviors that are different than kind of classic OCD compulsions, and kind of the more severe the ASD symptoms are, and the the more you will see these atypical anxiety symptoms, though you could see them in any child. So the takeaway being that in autism, we often see a mix of kind of classic anxiety symptoms and then these kind of atypical or different anxiety symptoms, but they're not atypical for autism. They're just atypical compared to kind of what the book says anxiety is. And so what does this look like? I think this is well known to all of you, many, as parents, but avoidance, crying, particularly in response to very specific stimuli like an elevator or a crowded room, freezing, clinging to parents or trusted people. Certainly we can see an increase in, if they have a typical repetitive behavior, you could see an increase in that or an increase in vocalization. And then, more challenging things, irritability, tantrums, aggression, self-injury, and also sleep. Sleep is, I think, a huge barometer for how our kids are doing. And you will often see anxiety emerge as sleep problems. So those are some of the kind of classically defined psychiatric disorders. So we kind of went through depression, anxiety, et cetera, and then I focused particularly on anxiety. So I also wanted to talk about a related concept because I think it comes into play a great deal in our the youth with autism's daily lives, and particularly relates to the pandemic challenges, which is this concept of emotion regulation. So this is a newer emerging concept, I would say, over the past decade again. So what is emotion regulation? Well, this kind of strict definition is it's the ability to monitor and modify your arousal and reactivity so that you can engage in adaptive behavior. So what does that really mean? Well, it basically means, can I calm myself and keep myself regulated so I can do what I need to do? And so my brain can stay, the front of my brain can stay engaged and processing. That's what that means. And so further definition, it involves intentional and automatic attempts to manage affect, which is your emotion expression. And you can do that utilizing either things you've learned internal, or you can use external structures, the people around you, to try to do that. And so this is an emerging concept in autism and also in other areas for human behavior. And so I think we definitely know that individuals with autism seem to be predisposed to having deficits or challenges with emotion regulation to varying degrees. And this isn't, I think, hard to imagine when you think about some of the challenges we do see in autism with executive functioning, the ability to be abstract or think in an abstract way, and self-awareness or self-monitoring. Those challenges would then impair your ability to regulate your emotions. And that it's more common and more severe in people with autism. And so what does this look like? Well, it looks like some of those things we named before, that poor challenges with emotion regulation is one of the things that leads to a child doing fine, and then exploding and having what people call a meltdown. And very often, because of the challenges with identifying emotions, processing their own emotions, et cetera, they may not even know why they're angry or why this is happening. It's just happening. And then we can see some of those downstream effects of behaviors like aggression and self-injury and other things. So just to give a little more window into this, I thought it'd be helpful to just say, well, how would you, to help you kind of wrap your mind around this concept of emotion regulation, well, how would you help someone with their emotion regulation? So this is a slide from one of my colleagues who has developed some treatments for emotion regulation, targeting emotion regulation. And so we're not going to go through this whole slide, but just to give you a picture. So one thing you would do to help someone who has challenges with emotion regulation is try to train them or help them to recognize their emotional intensity. So, and there are lots of ways to do this, but you can picture, people often use thermometers. So with a child, so are you hot? Are you medium? Or are you cold? That type of thing. But helping them recognize where they are emotionally, that's a key step, obviously. And sort of on the left side, you can see these are some of the ways a therapist would work therapeutically to try to help a child build greater emotion regulation capacity. So that's our background, right? So kids with autism, struggle with often with kind of mental health challenges, and I think many, if not all, to some degree have challenges with emotion regulation. And that's the world we live in. And then a new world arrived, right, in March of last year, and it was the pandemic. And I think we've all gotten a little bit used to this now. It's how we've been living for a year. But in preparing for this talk and thinking back, I think we can't, we have to go back and just think, like, can you imagine a more sudden, dramatic, all-encompassing change to the world than what this was and what it continues to be? And what has it introduced? It's introduced massive uncertainty. What can I do? What can't I do? It changes day to day, week to week. For our kids, it instantly removed many of the routines and structures that they depend on. And I think something that's really difficult, I think, for some of them is, why did this happen? Well, this thing is going around. You can't see it. You can't smell it. You can't taste it. It might hurt you. But if you do these things, you'll be safe, but maybe you're not safe. And maybe we can go in the store, but maybe you can't. So even though a virus is a concrete thing to picture, it's a very abstract concept, the pandemic. And I think that this is very hard for some of our kids to understand. What is this, and why do we all have to behave differently? And why do the rules keep changing every week or every other month? So just, perhaps to state the obvious, just a massive challenge. And then there's also just very real restrictions on their movement, their interactions, what they can do. We know that our kids really depend on routines, and I can hardly think of a routine that hasn't been interrupted by the pandemic in some way. And so people are already starting to do there's just a little bit of research on what are the effects of this for people with developmental disabilities. And so there's some preliminary studies that definitely show, not surprisingly, we've seen what are called acute stress reactions and post-traumatic stress symptoms, often with a big loss, like I lost my school, I lost the routine I did every day at the grocery store, or whatever it is. There has been more rarely some reports of psychotic and less rarely mood symptoms with people who get coronavirus, including kids. And then we have certainly seen some worsening suicidal ideation and even suicide attempts related to fears around coronavirus or COVID-19. And this is generally in people with developmental disabilities, and this is preliminary work, but I thought worth mentioning. And then I think it's also worth mentioning, even though it is perhaps obvious, that this is really a vulnerable group of people. I don't know if any of us are weathering the pandemic well, but kids with autism, I think, are quite vulnerable. And the World Health Organization definition of vulnerability is the degree, when they think about disasters, they say, well, what is the degree to which a population, an individual, or an organization is unable to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impacts of a disaster? And if I think about many of our kids with autism, this is a population that is not able to anticipate things well or cope well, and so they're very vulnerable, I think, to a disaster, which this pandemic definitely meets the definition of a disaster. And so why is that? Well, let's just think about our general autism cognitive profile. And this is general, every kid is different, but generally, there is this concept I mentioned before of intolerance of uncertainty, IU. One of the biggest challenges for many folks with autism is that it's very difficult for them to tolerate uncertainty. It has to be this way or that way. Or I need to know that I'm doing this at this time and then that time. And change is hard, but even worse is if it's uncertain. Well, maybe we'll do this and maybe we'll do that. That's very difficult. And clearly the whole pandemic is uncertainty. People with autism also can have difficulty making future predictions. Like, I will be okay if I do X, which is a calculation we're doing all the time. If I wear my mask and I do this, then I'll be okay, maybe. That's difficult. Also envisioning multiple possible outcomes, like, so in other words, they might just envision one outcome. I'm going to get sick, as opposed to like, well, I could get sick, but I could be okay, or I could get sick and recover. Increased rates of anxiety, the emotional regulation challenges. And then, there is certainly some challenges with cognitive flexibility and coping. So a way of saying, I think just, we have a very vulnerable group of kids. I have just a couple more slides. So just to say, so this is not from a study, this is from just my observations, that I think the early effects of the pandemic, if we think back to like March, April, May, June, they were massive and immediate. Kids, essentially almost all kids lost their school supports. Everyone was home for March and April, and some kids for much longer. We couldn't follow IEPs, it's impossible. They're all written for in-person services. And those of you, the people who have in-home services, such as Section 28 or 65 or other in-home services, many of those ceased or were put on pause due to the understandable concern of virus transmission. But for the child and family, obviously just a massive loss and a sudden one. Then I think beyond that, I think we also have to recognize that our kids have had decreased access to the people who try to help them outside the family. So therapists, psychiatrists, developmental pediatricians, any mental health practitioner. You're lucky if you are having telehealth visits. And even that is limited, I think, to some degree. So they've had decreased access to the supports that they need. Also, decreased access to routine medical care. So there were no dental visits for months. It's still hard to get in to see the dentist. All the things that we need to do to maintain our health and maintain our children's health have been more difficult. And clearly people are way behind usually in this care. And of course that can affect mental health and behavior. We're definitely seeing an increased rate of dental problems and other things. And then just getting very specific to some of our experience at Maine Behavioral Health Care. As an example, so we run a day treatment program in South Portland at CAD, and we have 15 kids there. So this is day treatment. These are children who are sent, this is an out of district placement because they have challenges with usually their emotions or behavior or both. When the pandemic started, we have 15 children in our program, and they were pretty much fairly stable and doing pretty well while we were working on things. And we were planning to transition several of them back to their local school districts. Pandemic hits, we do our best, we convert to tele, we're trying to support them in their homes. And these 15 kids who are relatively stable, within 6 weeks, 3 of them have to be psychiatrically hospitalized. Whereas in a normal year, in a whole year, maybe 1. So I think sometimes we underappreciate what a stabilizing force school and particularly intensive school treatment programs are. And that was really a reminder, I think, to us of like, wow, like look what happens when this is removed. Just another piece of data is we have our developmental disorders unit at Spring Harbor Hospital, which is a specialized inpatient unit for kids with autism and developmental disabilities if they're experiencing an emotional or behavioral crisis. And typically the wait list for that unit is 0 to 3 children waiting. For the past 9 months, we have had 12 to 15 kids waiting persistently, which is terrible. And it just tells you, so the demand, if you will, for inpatient, for the highest level of care is multiple times higher. So I think it's just a sign of how much kids are struggling without some of the supports and et cetera. And then we're definitely seeing an increased visit rate to emergency rooms because of behavioral crises. So just some very real effects and very obvious ones. Finally, in terms of, I think another thing to think about is just our kids' daily experience is so different now. You know, they have increased unstructured time at home, usually a lot more unstructured time. And that may sound great to the child, but actually usually isn't great because their leisure or play skills are not well developed. They can't entertain themselves necessarily, or they can only do it in one very narrow way. And so that's a real challenge. The whole concept of doing school from home, which then puts the parents in a new and, you know, potentially not welcome role as an ed tech or a teacher, is a huge change and challenge. Obviously, they have decreased access to their routine activities. They may have increased access to preferred reinforcers or routines at home, and then they become saturated with those reinforcers, potentially. There's a decreased demand for self-care, right? They don't have to get up and go to school and get dressed in the same way. And so we've broken those routines. And there's also decreased social demands, which generally is not a good thing in terms of someone's social development. So their daily experience is quite different. And then, so what's the effect on parents? So there's actually started to be some research on this, effect on parents during this COVID pandemic. So I found one study out of China where they surveyed 6,000 parents in China, and about 3/4 did not have a child with autism and 1/4 did. And what they found in this survey, and this is parent self-report, is the parents reported that the parents of kids with ASD had lower resilience and positive coping during the pandemic, and they were finding that they were using more negative strategies with their kids. And then very interestingly, the parents self-reported symptoms of anxiety and depression. The parents of children with autism, it was about, for anxiety, it was about double the rate of symptoms. And in depression, it was about 1/3 higher. So in this one study, parents of kids with autism basically reported that they were struggling more on average than parents of kids without autism during this COVID-19 pandemic. So that's where I'm going to stop and hand it over to the other Dr. Siegel. So let me stop sharing my screen. Just a minute. Sorry, I'm just struggling with this, of course, as always. Why don't you try, Dr. Siegel, to share your screen, and maybe it will just boot me
I
off.
don't think it's going to let me.
Okay.
It won't let me. Share.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, there you go.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Matt. So let me bring up my slides here. Hopefully I can do it quickly. So, okay, just make sure I'm not just running into one problem myself. Oh, I think I see the problem. All right, I think I got it. I'm just gonna check. Okay, perfect. I think that's it. So thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my sort of work and thoughts in working with families. I'm a child and family therapist, and I work primarily with families that have children with autism. And this has been a pretty extraordinary year in terms of watching what families are working so hard to endure and manage. I am really thinking about COVID in terms of an arc, that we had this initial period and in between period that we're kind of coming out of now and about to enter a reemergence, reentry period. But what really strikes me is just what an extraordinary impact on families this year has been. It is amazing to hear how much parents' work is disrupted and even discontinued, people having to stop working, how hard people have had to work to rebuild and adjust household schedules, and even for parents who never planned to be teachers to have to be teachers this year, which has been pretty extraordinary. And although there's definitely been some silver linings, the impact is extraordinary. So like I said, I really think about this year in 3 phases. So the first year was that initial shutdown of activities and lockdown. And there was so much information to absorb and so many changes, so much that we had to learn about the pandemic and changes that we had to accept and accommodations we had to make. Try to imagine new routines, forget even building routines, just even trying to imagine them and establishing plans for support. So that was the first period, and obviously just a tremendous transition. And then in terms of the second phase, the second transition was functioning within the hybrid or remote model. And that's what we've been in now for numerous months. And in that period, the priorities were developing and maintaining new routines, structuring academics with academic blocks at home, some kids and some young adults doing all their programming at home for full-time, others doing a hybrid model, but either way, they're needing to be, with very few exceptions, a tremendous amount of academic and life skill work being done at home. And then this third phase, I really think of where we are right now. And that is just the beginning of reentry. And so this is we're hardly on the other side of COVID. It's more like we're just beginning to see the entry, the pathway to the other side of COVID. So I think of this as sort of the beginning of normal returning. For many, this can seem like a relief, and certainly I see some things, I imagine things that we'll be able to do on the other side of COVID that seems like such a relief. And while that's true, there are many things that are hard to imagine. We've gotten used to, in some ways, this COVID normal. And the idea of doing things back the way we used to can seem a little bit overwhelming, even to adults. For children with ASD and their families, this next transition may be just as difficult as the initial phase, that initial transition. So like I just said, many children have adjusted to the COVID normal. And for some, exiting that normal might be hard, both for those that found COVID restrictions actually to bring some relief. It's kind of interesting to think about. For some kids, the reduced social demands, the reduced requirements of being at school felt like a relief in some areas. So for those kids, the idea of sort of going back to normal might be hard to imagine. But even for those that do look forward to reentry, there's an awful lot of change and awful lot of components of transition ahead that will be challenging to manage. So in thinking about what does lie ahead for your child or your adult, I think it's fair to say that there will be gaps. There will be some regression in skills, but the intensity and stability of those gaps are not inevitable. I mean, the truth is, we've never had a pandemic before. We don't know exactly what this will mean in terms of how long it may take for children and young adults and adults to close some of those gaps that have emerged over this past year. So I like to think about how to make that transition back to normal go as smoothly as possible. And when I say that, I do not imagine that it will be particularly smooth, but just trying to think about what steps we can take. So one is assessment. And when I say assessment, I don't mean formal assessment, but informal observations, and then any assessment that providers are doing. I'll talk about that in a second. The second is really understanding what children are going through this time, and then considering a step-by-step approach to return, as opposed to just going, sort of stepping in this next phase all at once. So assessing the situation, again, kind of thinking about it informally. Overall, thinking about what your child's response to COVID has been, I think could be helpful. It's helpful to think about, so what have they been missing? I don't mean what have they been missing actually, but what have they been missing from in terms of their thoughts and feelings that they miss most about, quote, normal life? In what ways are they actually more comfortable at home? I think that's really important to think about when you think about what their experience may be in that reintegration process. Again, just informally thinking about what skill changes you're seeing, what social, academic, adaptive, emotional, behavioral challenges you may be seeing more of over the last year. Or interestingly, are you seeing less of some of those difficulties because there are fewer demands on your child? So it's interesting to think of these things from both angles. And then thinking about services, as was mentioned, some services were on hold for a while. Some were able to be reestablished. Some weren't, depending on providers' ability to meet, whether they could meet in person or virtually, or in some cases, providers have been able to meet virtually, but it hasn't worked for kids to get their services virtually. So thinking about where services are at this time for your child or adult. And then, as talked about so importantly, what is the role of anxiety in this particular sort of part of the arc? I think it can be helpful to think of the questions that I just posed in terms of what role anxiety may be playing. So what your child might be feeling about returning is important. What your child might need most upon return in terms of what supports they might need is really important. And again, just thinking about what for them, where might anxiety play out for them? Were they particularly anxious before, generally anxious? Are there things about as most children are with ASD, transitions are very difficult. Are they particularly difficult for your child or adult? Is your child or adult particularly anxious about COVID? And what is their stress level about returning to what may feel like old stressors and higher expectations? So, so just when you think about the pace, thinking about making a plan on how to return to normal, I think is very, very helpful. So we want to think about heading back to normal, that pace being quick enough that kids don't have unnecessary anticipatory anxiety. We're not creating a situation of anticipatory anxiety, but not so quickly as to cause flooding of anxiety. And I think something that can be really helpful is thinking about a stepwise approach to returning to post-COVID life, especially for children feeling particularly anxious. So part of thinking about that plan and that pacing is thinking about reintroducing demands and expectations, emphasizing it, tiering the emphasis of areas. So children, so school age children, really prioritizing and emphasizing that return to school. For adults, it might be emphasizing and prioritizing that return to day programming and putting one's thoughts and attentions into how to do that in increments. So for example, if your child is in a hybrid model right now, going to school 2 days a week, might make sense to think of initially increasing to a third day, 1 week, another day the next week. If your child, for example, is getting maybe some special ed services, they're going to school more often because they're getting special ed services. Maybe they're going for half days. So increasing by half days, some days per week. Either way, not going right back to the full swing 5 days, 5 days a week right away may be an important part of making this transition more manageable for your child or adult. It may be possible to look into COVID supports that your child or adult might be getting in that are special for this COVID period. It may be helpful to consider looking into if those COVID supports can be maintained even after the initial return to school. I think it's really going to be important for parents to have to get some check-ins with staff, whether it's at school or a day program, to understand how their child is managing with increased time at school, and that pacing that we're talking about of return can be flexed and adjusted somewhat based on the child's feedback, parent observations, but also staff feedback of what they're seeing. As I said before, would think about tiering return. So for example, if your child pre-COVID went to school and went to karate a day or 2 days a week, and they haven't gone to karate all year, and they've only been going to school, let's say hybrid during the year, I would refrain from going back to both things at the same time. And this is, of course, nothing that's negative about martial arts, just the idea of how many demands we want to think about putting on children at one time. One thing that you can do now, so different depending on where you live, you may have your school district may be going at different paces in terms of what access to school you have now and what the return is going to look like. So one thing that you can do in terms of sort of building that capacity for returning is thinking about kind of community fitness level now, and thinking about ways that your family, your children can practice slowly increasing time in the community. Of course, when I say this, I mean increasing time while minimizing risks and following all COVID guidelines. But thinking about if you have a child who has not spent a lot of time out in the community, to think of a stepwise approach, even to just doing different things, whether that's going for drives, going to stores, drive-through, takeout, whatever that might look like to increasing time not only in different settings, but with different people. Again, being careful about risk, thinking about maybe spending some time with family and friends in a safe way outside. If your child has been remote full-time, one thing that you can be thinking about as you anticipate returning is visiting the school if possible, is as simply as driving by, or the day program, and begin to adjust daily routines to include and to expand more of these demands for exposure, for social exposure and exposure to different settings. So just part of that build up. So an important thing to think about is that kids are going to have, and adults are going to have a lot of different feelings about this reentry. And some of them are going to be really negative, some will be positive, some very mixed. And I think it can be helpful from a mental health point of view to just think about any thoughts that your child has about reentry is okay. And that it's okay to reflect those feelings, to acknowledge that transitions can be really hard. Noting, as we're talking about, that the transition may be able to be done step by step and will not be all of a sudden. One thing that I'm talking to my patients about is that you won't just wake up one morning and just everything will be like it was before, that there will be steps to take to get used to getting from here to there. That kids will have time to feel more comfortable. It can be helpful to do something, call it bridging forward and bridging back. Bridging forward is thinking about imagining positive aspects of return. What might returning look like? If kids bring up sort of concerns and questions as they imagine those aspects of returning, even positive, you know, pose challenges and talk about problems, trying to problem solve some of those challenges that they anticipate to the best of your ability. And then bridging back a little bit, reminding that kids that some of the positive aspects of COVID life can be maintained. So if you have a child who has really been enjoying a lot of Minecraft over the last year, because there's a lot more time at home, and every family has understandably had a lot more technology in their lives. If they've had a lot more Minecraft, it's okay to say, you know, I can imagine it's hard to imagine going back to school and having less of the things that you have enjoyed, but I'm going to promise you we're still going to have plenty of Minecraft time, and even incorporating that into the schedule so that they don't feel that the reentry necessarily means the loss of some of the things that they have enjoyed over the last year. It can be helpful to think about using sort of positive forward-moving language, acknowledging feelings, but also kind of showing what that path forward can look like. I know it's hard to imagine going back to school, but it might be nice to see your teacher in person. Actually, might be is not as good as I bet it will be nice, because we want to send that positive message. Offer replacement thoughts for an accurate idea. So, like I just said, if your child says, well, now I'm never going to be able to play video games ever again if I have to go back to school, it's very reasonable to say, well, no, we can do both. You can go back to school, we'll do it step by step, but we're gonna be able to keep doing some of those things that you've enjoyed so much. Remind your child that they can manage hard things. This is hard. This whole year has had aspects that are very hard. So your child has already managed and handled tremendously difficult things. And noticing as you go along in terms of that reentry can be really important. Not only in terms of managing anxiety, but building a sense of competence and confidence in themselves. Remember that this process is going to take a lot of energy. The increased demands that kids are going to be facing, even if you take a stepwise approach, is going to be significant. Kids and adults will need time to regroup and recharge. And also parents are going to have to make a lot of adjustments to handle numerous moving parts. On the one hand, parents miss so many of the things that they were doing before. On the other hand, going back to a regular schedule is going back to perhaps complicated driving routines, complicated household logistical issues that are going to be a lot to manage as well. So giving yourself as parents breaks is important, and praising your child, your adult with autism, and yourself and one another each step of the way is very, very important. So just as a quick summary before we go to questions, which we are looking forward to, keep in mind that coming out of COVID is as big as a transition as entering was. And for children with ASD, it is beneficial to recognize the significance of this transition and to plan for it. And as we talked about, thinking about assessing the situation, understanding how kids are thinking and feeling, and making a step-by-step plan to get through this reentry period until we're back to what is normal. So let me unshare my screen here. And that is my portion, and we are excited to open things up to questions.
So we have some questions in the Q&A, which I can read out. I just want to check. I didn't know, Tara, if you wanted to run that piece, or we can just proceed.
No, I can, if you'd like me to, I'll read off some questions for you that we have. I'm kind of keeping track of what was coming through. The first question I have is from Lori, and she is an adult on the spectrum, and she is wondering about challenges that you've heard about or run into during the pandemic in adults.
I can offer a few thoughts. You know, and we certainly do not mean to exclude adults. I think, you know, focused on youth in our presentations, but of course, this affects everyone. So some of the things that I've observed with adults, many of the adults I serve have more intensive challenges, minimally verbal, perhaps intellectual disability, often in group homes or at home with their parents, even as adults. And several challenges. So some just a real loss of supports. So staff, you know, many adults who had staff who would come into the home, either through Section 21 waiver or other services, and a lot of those agencies stopped coming, or they come less, and that's a huge loss and challenge. I think another challenge we've certainly seen with adults and kids is this requirement to wear masks, which is, of course, understandable and necessary from a public health standpoint. But, you know, I interact with many individuals where that is not an option, or it is an option that we can achieve after many weeks of working on it. And we have had quite a few people who achieve it, but it isn't happening right away. And we've definitely had some very unfortunate situations in the community where people, even when it is explained that the individual has a developmental disability, they are ushered out of a store or other thing. And so that's, you know, been very challenging, I think, for adults and kids.
Tara, in my experience with adults, I think some of the same issues of just loss of structure and routine is just very significant, and that may be losing access to a day program, different activities that they do, losing their job, maybe related to COVID, or just other logistical things that make then accessing what they had done before not possible. And so I think that disruption of routines and of the structure of life is very difficult for children and adults.
Yeah. Samantha is asking if panic and anxiety attacks look different for adolescents with ASD as compared to the non-ASD peers.
I imagine we both might have something to say about that. So I'll start. I saw this question in the Q&A, and I love this question because I think it's so important. So the answer is yes and no. So sometimes it can look, panic and anxiety can look the same as in other, as in adolescents in peers who don't have autism. So, you know, classic symptoms of panic are kind of elevated heart rate and breathing fast, but maybe feeling like you can't breathe, or you're short of breath, and that your heart is racing, whether it is racing or not, and even a feeling of like your throat closing up potentially, or the walls are closing in on you. Those are kind of classic panic feelings and experiences, and being very distressed. And certainly Kids, adolescents with autism can, I think, experience all of those things. And then some, though, they experience panic differently. They experience it as just feeling enormously stressed. And then what you might observe is an external behavior, so getting aggressive or eloping, running out of the building or room. And maybe potentially less ability to describe what they're experiencing, and more you just see the behavior, the action. And then I think that's panic. And then for anxiety in general, I think that probably in general in autism, I think that we're going to see people show their anxiety more through irritability and withdrawal than maybe some kids who don't have autism, who might be more prone to saying that they're worried about something, or avoiding things, but in a more adaptive way, a less problematic way. So those are maybe some differences.
That sounds good.
So now we are having the question of, do you have recommendations on how parents in school should address regression across the board? Educational, developmental, emotional. This is a big question we've been getting.
Yeah, it's such a huge question. Again, it goes back to this issue that we just haven't been in this experience. We haven't been in this situation before. And so I think, as I said, there will be, between parental observation, teacher observation, provider observation, there's going to be recognition of regression in different skill areas. I think some of it, we want to think about, again, if the regression has brought about services in this COVID period, that's one thing I want to really suggest is parents consider asking schools if it's possible to carry over some of those services when the child initially, when I talk about going back to school, I mean doing more school, whatever that might look like. And I don't know how possible that will be, but the more we think of structuring that return, the more I think we can get a chance to see how long will that gap look as big as it does right now. So we don't know, is it something that once children are back in school after X amount of time, that gap closes faster than we might imagine or we might fear when we see the size of it now. So I really think less about there's no magical way to do it, but to try to carry in to school as much support as possible so that we can minimize the difficulty and let that child get back into their mode and see how quickly they're able to resume their previous skill level.
So that kind of goes with the next one, is the question of how slowly or quickly should it be introduced to avoid overwhelming the children?
Yeah. Matt, do you mind if I do two in a row?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, this is one of those unpleasant answers, which is there is no right answer. The answer is really trying to think about your own child. So that idea of, what has the experience been like for them? What do their needs look like? The rate there, I see some children in my practice who going back relatively quickly will probably be fine. And in fact, they're looking forward to it. I still wouldn't say you would go 100%, even with lots of enthusiasm and excitement, because as from an adult perspective, we can see that that doing things step by step can help to minimize unexpected difficulties. So even the most the child that you feel least concerned with, I would not do 100% right away. But how much you slow it down really depends on the level of concern that your child has about returning. Now, having said that, and this is why this is one of these sort of unpleasant answers, is that you also don't want to say, if a child says, I just don't want to go back, okay, you don't have to. That's not helpful either. So trying to find that spot between not supporting avoidance, but not rushing a child too quickly. And that is really a kid by kid and adult by adult question. But those are some of the principles, I think, of thinking about return that I hope are helpful.
And maybe I would just add that I think there is a normal human proclivity to want everything to just be fine, and to really without otherwise thoughtful people, without thinking about it much, just saying, well, we're just going to pick up where we left off, back in March, or we're just gonna resume his IEP how it was, and we all want things to be back how they were, and to magically be back on March 1st or whatever the date was. But I think as a parent, one of the most important roles you can play, as Emily said, is to fight that urge a little bit and help remind the team, whether it's the educational team for your school age child, or the job, vocational, or day programming team, the adult for your adult, is that this is a huge transition back, and so it needs to actually be done in a thoughtful way. Really, when we all recognize when a kid is transitioning from 8th grade to high school, we see that as a big step, right? And then they often do a step-up day, and they visit, and there's a transition. Well, this is like 10 times that transition, in my view. And so I think just that's one of the most important things you can do as a parent, is, kind of respectfully saying, okay, like, whoa, how are we supporting this child through this, and trying to do the best we can.
And Tara, it can be helpful to remember that all kids are going to have gaps. So your child will not, or your adult will not be the only one who's showing signs of regression. So I think that can just be helpful in kind of settling that sort of parental tension and urgency, to just know that this arc is going to continue, and children will get there, but they're all going to be at different points struggling to resume to their previous functioning.
We have somebody asking about opportunities for online connections for adolescents, socializing more. If you know of any, is one of the questions, and I can kind of step in on that a little bit. We actually have a lot of resources at the office. So if anybody would like to call or send an email, we do have a resource list with online social groups, things like that. I'm not sure if either of you know of any in your area. And do you suggest maybe doing those, or maybe if they have, I know some places are starting to do small in-person, kind of get people back in the groove. And what do you think of those?
I don't know of any particular online groups, but I love the question, because it's exactly the concept I think that we're talking about, which is, how do you scaffold or help build your child back to or adult to where you want them to go. So they're at home, maybe having very little interaction. If you really think about it, potentially very little interaction with other kids. So a great next step is some online interaction, right? And then maybe within COVID parameters, safety parameters, a small group. That would be a great pathway, as opposed to I'm at home, very little interaction. and then I'm back at school with 60 kids or whatever it is. So I love the concept, and I'm glad I know Autism Society of Maine. You have incredible resources for people, so I think that's a place to turn.
Yes, we do have a couple online groups for, I think all of the ages would go from 11 to 26, I think we have available with different groups. So they can just contact us and we'll hook them up. Let's see, Lori would like to know if you would help an adult on the spectrum with ER differently than you would a child.
All right, I'll take that. Or I'll start. So I think so, but only from a developmental perspective. So in other words, whereas with a child, you might work on identifying emotions and making that more concrete for a child by using a thermometer, like I said before, and having kind of literally drawing a thermometer and having the cold and the neutral and the hot, and then practicing with them, ideally, because that's the best learning, right? It's not to be told something or shown something, it's to actually experience it. And so if you're with them and you're so fortunate that unfortunately they're starting to feel upset or something in that moment, repeatedly doing that teaching, that's how you might approach it with a child or with an adult who has significant developmental delay. But with an adult, I think we're going to, approach that potentially less visually or less concretely, and it may be more of a discussion, or we may use a visual, but we're going to write out the words instead of having a thermometer. So I think that's the difference that comes to mind. I don't think so how you learn the skills and approach the concepts and the strategies you use are going to be just different developmentally, but they're the same concepts and strategies.
Emily, going to add to that? Or
I was thinking about it. I'm trying to do it. Do we have many more questions? Because I'm happy to add. I'm also want to make sure that we get through questions.
We've got 3 or 4 here.
Okay, let's go to the next question. If we have time, I can come back and talk a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy and,
perfect.
And emotional regulation.
Jade is looking for some advice. She has a daughter who is going to be 6 in May, and they're currently doing kindergarten in hybrid, 2 days a week in school, 3 at home. Since the pandemic has started, her daughter's become increasingly obsessed that she will forget things and people. They've gotten her an old smartphone that she can take pictures with, but it doesn't seem to be helping. Any advice?
That she's going to forget people like that she knew from before?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that's so fair. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would think about it in a couple different ways. It sounds like already parents are thinking about it in one way that I would, which is try to refamiliarize her. Mm-hmm. So visiting, pictures, anything that they can do to expose her to people and faces at the school. Did you say at school 2 days a week?
Yes.
So I guess she's thinking about kids and adults that she doesn't see on her 2 days. So how to remember people, and maybe in the other cohort, perhaps. Mm-hmm. I would see if if they've got a school website, looking online if there's any pictures of the school, of classes. Sometimes there's sort of action shots of kids. Again, it wouldn't be that they'd be looking necessarily for particular kids, but just being reminded of what those images are like. It may be that there are some opportunities, maybe letting the teacher know that there's some concern about remembering the other cohort might actually prompt the teacher to come up with some creative ways to sort of swap info. There could almost be like cohort, sister brother cohort kind of ideas of writing notes to each other or sending pictures or something like that, which could really help with that principle of refamiliarizing and rebuilding. And what I think will come with that increased familiarity is a decrease in anxiety, because that's so much, Matt, as you talked about at the beginning, that atypical anxiety is anxiety about things that are not familiar. So it's almost like she's losing that sense of familiarity, certainly with the other cohort.
Yeah, I completely agree. And maybe just to state the obvious, I mean, this very much sounds like this is an anxiety symptom, right? This, or expression of anxiety. I'm going to forget this person. I'm going to forget that I saw this. I'm going to forget this banana, which I see is in the chat. That was one of the examples, the banana. So the way I hear that is, will I be okay? If I forget this, will I still be okay? If I forget this, will this person still be there, you know, tomorrow? And so I hear it very much as a sort of this child's way of taking all the uncertainty and the will we be okay of the pandemic and bringing it down to like, will I be okay if will I remember the banana, or will I remember the kid in the other cohort? So I think just approaching it as an anxiety symptom, you know, maybe gives you a start.
Really reflecting that worry, you know, being able to say, I understand that you feel worried about going back, and sort of going back to that list that I had before, you know, that we'll do this step by step. We'll figure it out together. We'll be able to manage it. Be helpful.
Okay, now I have Robin. This is kind of interesting. Interacting with her 19-year-old diagnosed with PPD and OS, noticed heightened compulsive behavior since COVID. She seems to overfixate on items and issues. It's very difficult to get her mind off those items and issues. It requires a great deal of patience on my part. How can I help, and how can I stay sane? One of the examples she used is her daughter is 19, but insists that she's 18, and she wants to remain that way. She's not going to get any older.
Like that. Matt, I feel like this is one that we could practically answer simultaneously. But I think, you know, I think that I really appreciate that during such a difficult year where people are all looking to control things, to make the chaos feel manageable. So being extra focused on something, I think, can really reflect that desire to bring some order to what has felt like a chaotic situation. And also kids are, and adults, she's an adult, with less exposure don't have as many things to think about. You know, I know that's a very sort of simplistic way of thinking about it, but I have definitely found that in my practice that there can be a reduced number of pathways of things to focus on. And again, it can be very appealing to have that over focus to manage anxiety.
Absolutely. And then I can't resist adding that the turning 19 and insisting one is 18 is a very mild form of what is sometimes called the Peter Pan syndrome. I don't want to grow up. And that's not a criticism. It's a very normal, I think, feeling that probably every high school senior or person going through a major change has. And but I think we've seen it many times, and can become very concrete of, I'm not going to leave my school. I am not 19. And again, it is an anxiety. I think you can understand it from an anxiety perspective of, as Emily said, you know, we're not wanting the world to change. I want my old world back. And certainly with the pandemic, I want things how they used to be. And so, you know, would bring thoughts along the way of trying to emphasize, well, what is different, but what's the same? You know, how can we get older but continue to enjoy and do the things we've always done? Those are just some of the kind of thoughts that come to mind. So
Looks like the last question is from Lori, who is an adult, but has trouble recognizing emotions as an adult. She would like some help to figure out emotions that she's feeling or recognizing in others. Any suggestions on that?
I have, if it's possible, if she wants to leave her email with you, if that's possible, we could probably
Yeah.
get some resources to her that I think could be helpful along those lines.
Yeah, we can do that. So Lori, if you could just put your email me at the office. You can do library@asmonline.org, and I will make sure that they get your email address and we'll get you some resources. And it looks like that was the last question. We have a thank you for all your help. Jade really appreciates it.
We appreciate being here. Thank you so much for having us.
So
Yeah.
yes, thank you so much for doing all this. It was really informative. I think a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this, which is great. I think that was the point. The pandemic's kind of scared everybody, and now the talk of going back to normal. And I think that's almost just as scary, because nobody knows how to do that. So thank you so much for doing this for us, and we will be in touch.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.